The afternoon sun hammered down on the Egyptian desert as Erwin Rommel stood beside his command vehicle, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon to the northeast. It was the 1st of July, 1942, and from his position near the railway halt of El Alamein, he could see the faint shimmer of the Mediterranean Sea. Beyond that haze, less than 100 kilometers away, lay Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, gateway to the Suez Canal, and the key to British power in the Middle East. His panzers had covered over 800 kilometers in less than 3 weeks. They had smashed through Gazala, taken the fortress of Tobruk, and driven the British Eighth Army into headlong retreat. Now, standing at the threshold of his greatest victory, Rommel faced an enemy more implacable than any British general. He had no fuel. The Generalfeldmarschall lowered his binoculars and turned to face his chief of staff, Oberst Fritz Bayerlein. The younger officer's face was drawn with exhaustion, his uniform stained with the dust of 1,000 kilometers of pursuit. "What's the current fuel status?" Rommel asked, though he already knew the answer would not be good. Bayerlein consulted his notes, his voice carefully neutral. "We have enough fuel for perhaps 150 kilometers of movement, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. After that, the tanks stop where they stand." Rommel said nothing for a long moment. 150 kilometers might sound like a substantial reserve, but in the fluid warfare of the desert, where a single tactical maneuver could consume 50 kilometers of fuel in a day, it meant he had perhaps 3 days of operational capacity. 3 days to break through the British positions at El Alamein, capture Alexandria, and reach the Suez Canal, or 3 days to watch his army slowly immobilize itself in the sand. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The situation represented one of history's supreme ironies. Rommel commanded the most experienced desert fighting force in the world. His Afrika Korps and Italian allies had just achieved a stunning victory at Tobruk, capturing 33,000 British and Commonwealth prisoners along with vast quantities of supplies. The British Eighth Army was in disarray, streaming back toward the Egyptian frontier with Rommel's forces snapping at their heels. Intelligence reports suggested that Alexandria was gripped by panic, with the Royal Navy beginning to evacuate the harbor and British headquarters in Cairo burning documents in preparation for possible withdrawal. The entire Middle Eastern theater, Palestine, Iraq, the Persian Gulf oilfields, lay open before him. Yet his tanks were running on fumes. To understand how Rommel arrived at this maddening predicament, one must first understand the unique nature of desert warfare as practiced by the Afrika Korps. Unlike the grinding attritional battles on the Eastern Front or the methodical advances in Western Europe, combat in North Africa resembled naval warfare conducted on land. Armies maneuvered across vast empty spaces with few natural obstacles, seeking to outflank and envelop their opponents rather than batter through prepared defenses. Speed, mobility, and operational tempo mattered more than raw numbers. A commander who could concentrate his armor at the decisive point, who could move faster and strike harder than his opponent, could achieve victories wildly disproportionate to his numerical strength. This style of warfare suited Rommel's temperament perfectly. But it consumed fuel at a staggering rate. The German Army's standard battle tank in North Africa during the summer of 1942 was the Panzer III, equipped with the 50mm main gun. This vehicle carried 170 liters of fuel in its internal tanks, giving it an operational range of approximately 155 kilometers on roads and perhaps 95 kilometers across desert terrain. The heavier Panzer IV carried 470 liters and could travel 130 kilometers across country. These figures assumed normal combat operations, starting, stopping, maneuvering in combat formation, the constant revving and movement that characterized armored battle. In practice, a panzer division conducting aggressive offensive operations could exhaust its fuel reserves in 2 to 3 days of continuous action. Rommel's advance from Gazala to El Alamein had been a masterpiece of mobile warfare, but it had pushed his supply system beyond the breaking point. The distance from Tripoli, his primary supply port, to El Alamein was over 2,000 kilometers. Every liter of fuel that reached his tanks at the front had to be transported across this enormous distance, much of it along a single coastal road that wound through the Libyan desert. The trucks that carried this fuel consumed significant quantities themselves. A round trip from Tripoli to El Alamein required each truck to burn approximately 40% of its cargo simply to make the journey. The mathematics of logistics were working against him with cold efficiency. The root of Rommel's fuel crisis, however, lay not in the desert but in the Mediterranean Sea. Germany's ability to supply its armies in North Africa depended entirely on maintaining a steady flow of shipping from Italian ports to North African harbors. Throughout 1941 and early 1942, this maritime supply line had functioned reasonably well, though losses to British submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders were significant. But as Rommel pushed deeper into Egypt during the summer of 1942, the supply situation deteriorated catastrophically. The problem was both simple and insurmountable. The further east Rommel advanced, the longer his supply lines became, while the British supply lines from their bases in Egypt grew correspondingly shorter. During June 1942, as Rommel prepared for his climactic push toward Alexandria, the German-Italian supply situation in the Mediterranean reached crisis levels. British aircraft based in Malta, the island fortress that sat astride the central Mediterranean supply routes, intensified their attacks on Axis shipping. Submarines of the Royal Navy's 10th Flotilla, operating from Malta and Alexandria, hunted Italian tankers with devastating effectiveness. Between the beginning of June and the end of July, the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica flew thousands of sorties attempting to suppress Malta's air defenses, but the island refused to fall. The cost of this failure was measured in sinking ships and drowned cargoes. On the 20th of June, 1942, even as Rommel's forces were tightening their grip on Tobruk, the Italian tanker Reichenfels was torpedoed and sunk off Benghazi while carrying 3,000 tons of fuel destined for the Afrika Korps. 2 days later, the tanker Rosino Pilo went down with her cargo of fuel oil. On the 28th of June, as Tobruk surrendered and Rommel contemplated his drive into Egypt, another tanker, the Stella, was sunk south of Crete. Each of these losses represented roughly the equivalent of 1 week's fuel consumption for an armored division engaged in active operations. The fuel was being sent, but it was ending up on the bottom of the Mediterranean instead of in German tanks. Rommel was acutely aware of these losses, receiving daily reports on the supply situation from his logistics staff. His headquarters maintained detailed charts tracking every convoy, every ship, every ton of supplies that departed Italian ports bound for Africa. The men who maintained these charts watched helplessly as ship after ship was marked with red crosses indicating vessels lost to enemy action. By the end of June, the shipping losses had reached a rate that made sustained offensive operations mathematically impossible. Yet Rommel chose to advance anyway, believing that speed and momentum could substitute for adequate supplies. It was a gambler's calculation, and like all such calculations, it depended on luck holding out just a little longer. The geography of North Africa itself compounded Rommel's difficulties. While Tobruk's capture on the 21st of June had given him a major port facility only 500 kilometers from El Alamein, roughly half the distance from Tripoli, the British had systematically demolished the harbor installations before surrendering. German engineers worked frantically to restore the port's capacity, but clearing the harbor of scuttled ships, repairing the damaged piers and cranes, and establishing adequate anti-aircraft defenses all took time. During the crucial weeks of late June and early July, when Rommel's army was positioned to strike the decisive blow, Tobruk's harbor capacity remained severely limited. Most supplies still had to travel the crushing distance from Tripoli or Benghazi, consuming vast quantities of fuel in the process. The Italian High Command, Comando Supremo, had repeatedly warned Rommel about the impossibility of sustaining operations so far from adequate port facilities. Italian staff officers, trained in the sober realities of logistics and supply management, had calculated with depressing accuracy exactly how many tons of supplies per day would be required to maintain an army of Rommel's size in active combat operations near the Egyptian frontier. Their calculations showed that even if every ship reached port safely, even if Tobruk were fully operational, the maximum achievable supply rate would barely suffice to maintain defensive operations, let alone support an offensive. But Rommel had a history of achieving the impossible, and both German and Italian commanders hoped that his operational genius could somehow transcend the limitations of logistics. What Rommel possessed that summer was not adequate supplies but rather an extraordinary tactical opportunity. The British Eighth Army, under General Claude Imlach, was genuinely demoralized and disorganized after the disasters of Gazala and Tobruk. British armor doctrine, which dispersed tanks in small formations rather than concentrating them for decisive strikes, had proved catastrophically inferior to German tactical methods. British tank designs, particularly the American-built Grant and Stuart models that equipped many formations, were mechanically unreliable and undergunned compared to German panzers. British infantry, scattered in isolated defensive boxes without adequate anti-tank weapons, had been systematically surrounded and eliminated. The legend of German invincibility in armored warfare, built over 3 years of almost uninterrupted success, weighed heavily on British morale. Moreover, the British position at El Alamein, while geographically strong, was far from impregnable in early July. The El Alamein line extended about 65 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the impassable Qattara Depression in the south. This meant that Rommel could not employ his favorite tactic of wide flanking maneuvers around the southern end of the British position. The depression's steep cliffs and salt marshes made it utterly impassable to vehicles. But the British defenses were still thin and incomplete. Imlach had not yet had time to construct the deep minefields and interlocking defensive positions that would later make El Alamein virtually impregnable. The infantry divisions holding the line were exhausted and under strength. If Rommel could concentrate his armor effectively and punch through the British positions before they solidified, Alexandria and the Suez Canal might still be within reach. Rommel's plan for breaking through at El Alamein reflected both his operational boldness and his growing desperation about the supply situation. Rather than wait for adequate fuel stocks to accumulate, he decided to attack immediately, on the 1st of July, gambling that he could achieve a breakthrough quickly enough that fuel consumption would be minimized. The plan called for a concentrated armored thrust at the southern end of the British line, near the Ruisat Ridge, where intelligence suggested the defenses were weakest. Once through, his panzers would wheel north toward the coast, cutting off the British forces and opening the road to Alexandria. The entire operation was predicated on achieving success within 48 hours. Any longer, and his tanks would simply run out of fuel in the middle of the battlefield. The attack began at dawn on the 1st of July with an artillery barrage that sent shells screaming across the desert. The 90 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks of the Afrika Korps rolled forward in 2 columns, engines roaring, tracks churning up great plumes of sand and dust. Behind them came the infantry of the 90th Light Division, riding in trucks and armored half-tracks. The Italian 20th Corps, with its own complement of medium tanks, advanced on the German right flank. On paper, it looked like the opening moves of another brilliant Rommel victory. In practice, it immediately ran into problems. The British defensive positions, though thinly held, were manned by troops who had been ordered to hold at all costs. The New Zealand 2nd Division, positioned near Ruisat Ridge, had established well-camouflaged anti-tank gun positions and laid hasty minefields during the previous days of British retreat. More importantly, Imlach had begun implementing new tactical instructions based on hard-learned lessons. British anti-tank guns were now to hold their fire until German tanks close to under 1,000 yards, increasing the likelihood of first-round hits. Infantry was to remain in position and call down artillery fire rather than attempting to maneuver away from German armor. Most crucially, British tanks were to be used in concentrated formations rather than scattered across the battlefield. Rommel's panzers advanced into a storm of anti-tank fire. The British 6-pounder guns, recently arrived in Egypt and superior to the older 2-pounders, began knocking out German tanks at ranges the Afrika Korps had not previously encountered. The legendary German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, deployed in their secondary role as tank destroyers, found themselves dueling with dug-in British positions rather than catching enemy tanks in open maneuver. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. By nightfall of the 1st of July, the Afrika Korps had advanced perhaps 8 kilometers and lost 18 tanks, not catastrophic losses by Russian front standards, but deeply troubling given Rommel's limited reserves. The 2nd of July brought no better news. Rommel's forces attacked again, this time focusing on the northern sector near Tel El Isa, attempting to break through toward the coastal road. The assault made initial progress, capturing several British positions and taking prisoners, but again the advance bogged down in the face of determined resistance and accurate artillery fire. More critically, each hour of combat consumed fuel at rates that made Rommel's staff officers increasingly anxious. Tank companies reported fuel levels dropping below 50%. Some units were already beginning to consolidate their remaining fuel into the tanks of the most mechanically reliable vehicles, leaving others immobilized as makeshift pillboxes. It was during these first days of July that Rommel began making statements to his staff that revealed his growing awareness of the impossible situation he faced. On the evening of the 2nd of July, after receiving yet another report that the promised fuel convoy from Tobruk had been delayed by air attacks, Rommel turned to Bayerlein and spoke words that would be recorded in the Afrika Korps war diary: "We are in a position where every leader matters more than the courage of our soldiers. I can see Alexandria, but I cannot reach it." The statement captured the essence of his predicament with brutal clarity. For a commander whose entire career had been built on mobility, speed, and aggressive maneuver, to be paralyzed by something as prosaic as empty fuel tanks represented a form of warfare he found almost incomprehensible. The German High Command in Berlin, meanwhile, was pressing Rommel to achieve the decisive victory that would drive Britain from Egypt. Adolf Hitler had already announced to his inner circle that the capture of Alexandria was imminent and had begun making plans for a triumphal celebration of what he viewed as Germany's greatest strategic victory since the fall of France. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief for the Mediterranean theater, flew to Rommel's headquarters on the 3rd of July carrying promises of increased air support and additional supplies. When Rommel explained the fuel situation in detail, showing Kesselring the logistics charts that documented the widening gap between consumption and supply, Kesselring offered assurances that the Luftwaffe would intensify attacks on Malta and that the Italian Navy would provide better convoy protection. These were promises that meant little to tanks sitting motionless in the desert because their fuel tanks were empty. What made the situation particularly maddening for Rommel was that he could observe, through intelligence reports and aerial reconnaissance, that the British were using the time his fuel shortage granted them to strengthen their positions. Each day that passed saw additional British infantry battalions arriving at El Alamein from Palestine and Syria. Fresh tank regiments, equipped with new American Sherman tanks superior to anything in Rommel's arsenal, were being unloaded at Alexandria and rushed to the front. British engineers were laying thousands of anti-tank mines and stringing barbed wire across every likely avenue of approach. The window of opportunity that had briefly opened after the fall of Tobruk was closing with each passing hour, and Rommel could do nothing but watch it happen. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On the 4th of July, Rommel attempted another attack, this time concentrating what remained of his mobile forces against the Ruisat Ridge in the center of the British line. The assault began at 3 o'clock in the morning, with German and Italian infantry advancing under cover of darkness, supported by the remaining operational tanks of the Afrika Korps. The attack achieved initial surprise, overrunning several British positions and advancing nearly 5 kilometers before dawn. But as daylight broke, British artillery began ranging in on the German positions with devastating accuracy. Royal Air Force bombers appeared overhead, unmolested by the Luftwaffe, which lacked the fuel to maintain standing patrols over the battlefield. By mid-afternoon, the attack had stalled, and Rommel gave the order to consolidate the gains rather than push forward. The reason was simple: his tank commanders reported that most vehicles were running on reserves, with insufficient fuel even to conduct a tactical withdrawal if the British counterattacked. The fuel crisis manifested itself in ways both large and small across the battlefield. Tank crews learned to shut down their engines whenever possible, even during brief pauses in combat, to conserve every drop of fuel. The constant starting and stopping of tank engines, necessary to maintain combat readiness, was curtailed. Reconnaissance patrols were drastically reduced, leaving Rommel partially blind to British movements. Artillery units limited their fire missions, knowing that the trucks needed to bring forward ammunition were themselves running low on fuel. The entire tempo of operations slowed to a crawl, transforming the Afrika Korps from a fast-moving armored spearhead into a nearly static defensive force. Rommel's personal correspondence during this period reveals his psychological state with remarkable clarity. In a letter to his wife Lucy, written on the evening of the 5th of July, he expressed frustration in terms that were unusually blunt for a German field marshal. The letter, which survived the war and was later published, contained this passage: "The battle is going badly. Not because the enemy is stronger or our troops less brave, but because we have no fuel. The English sit 40 kilometers away and strengthen their positions hourly while we can do nothing. It is enough to make one weep." For a commander of Rommel's temperament, aggressive, confident, accustomed to seizing initiative, this enforced passivity represented a deeper defeat than any tactical reverse could inflict. The irony of the situation was compounded by the relative plenty that had existed just weeks earlier. After the capture of Tobruk on the 21st of June, Rommel's forces had seized enormous quantities of British supplies, including over 2,000 tons of fuel stored in the fortress's depots. For a brief moment, it had seemed as though the supply crisis might solve itself through captured enemy stocks. But that captured fuel had been consumed during the rapid advance from Tobruk to El Alamein, burned up by the very speed that had brought Rommel to the threshold of victory. Now, standing at the gates of Alexandria with empty tanks, he had nothing left to sustain the final push. The fuel that might have carried him to the Suez Canal had already been spent getting him to within sight of it. By the 10th of July, the First Battle of El Alamein, as it would later be called, had effectively ended in strategic stalemate. Rommel's forces had pushed the British back in several sectors and inflicted significant casualties, but they had achieved no breakthrough. More importantly, the fuel situation had deteriorated from critical to catastrophic. On that date, Rommel's headquarters recorded that the Afrika Korps possessed fuel reserves sufficient for only 35 kilometers of movement per vehicle, barely enough for a single day of defensive operations if the British counterattacked. Offensive operations requiring sustained movement were simply impossible. The mathematics of logistics had imposed their verdict: Rommel's army was effectively immobilized. It was around this time that Rommel made another statement that entered the historical record through the memoirs of several officers who heard it. During a conference with his division commanders on the 11th of July, while discussing whether to attempt one more push toward Alexandria, Rommel reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we stand 50 kilometers from Alexandria, and we might as well be in Berlin for all the good it does us. An army without fuel is not an army. It is a metal sculpture, impressive but useless." The comment, recorded in slightly different versions by different witnesses, captured not just frustration but a dawning realization that mobility, the very quality that had made the Afrika Korps so formidable, meant nothing without the fuel to sustain it. The British, meanwhile, were learning the same lesson from the opposite perspective. Auchinleck recognized that Rommel's offensive capacity had been broken not primarily by British combat effectiveness but by the simple fact that German tanks could not move. British intelligence officers, interrogating captured German soldiers, heard repeated complaints about fuel shortages. Royal Air Force reconnaissance flights observed German vehicles sitting motionless in the desert for days at a time, clear evidence that they lacked the fuel to relocate. British planners began to understand that if they could maintain pressure on Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean, they could strangle Rommel's army without necessarily defeating it in open battle. The strategic implications of this realization would shape British planning for the remainder of the North African campaign. For the common soldiers of the Afrika Korps, the fuel shortage translated into a grinding, inglorious form of combat utterly unlike the mobile warfare they had been trained for. Tank crews sat in their vehicles for hours in the brutal Egyptian heat, unable to run engines for cooling or to reposition to better defensive positions. Infantry units dug defensive trenches and laid mines, activities more reminiscent of the Western Front in the First World War than the sweeping maneuver warfare of 1940 through 1942. The morale impact was significant. German soldiers had come to believe in the legend of Rommel's invincibility, in the idea that mobility and superior tactics could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Now they were learning that even genius had its limits, and those limits were defined by fuel gauges approaching empty. The supply situation showed no signs of improvement throughout the middle weeks of July. On the 15th of July, the Italian tanker Montenevro was torpedoed and sunk while carrying fuel from Taranto to Tobruk. On the 20th of July, another tanker, the Vetter Pisani, was attacked by aircraft from Malta and damaged so severely it had to turn back to Italy. The pattern continued with grim regularity. Ships departed Italian ports loaded with desperately needed fuel, and British submarines or aircraft found them before they reached Africa. The fuel that did get through was barely sufficient to maintain defensive operations, let alone rebuild the reserves needed for renewed offensive action. Rommel attempted to compensate for fuel shortages through tactical ingenuity. He ordered his forces to establish strong defensive positions anchored on terrain features that commanded long fields of fire, minimizing the need for mobile counterattacks. He rotated his panzer divisions to the rear when possible, concentrating what fuel existed in the units actually in contact with the enemy. He established elaborate camouflage and deception measures to make the British believe his forces were stronger and more mobile than they actually were. These measures bought time and reduced casualties, but they could not change the fundamental reality. Without fuel, the Afrika Korps could not resume the offensive that might win the campaign. The German High Command's response to Rommel's situation revealed a profound disconnect between strategic ambitions and logistical realities. Throughout July, Rommel received messages from Berlin urging him to renew the offensive, to break through to Alexandria before British reinforcements made the task impossible. These messages invariably promised that additional supplies were en route, that the fuel crisis would soon be resolved, that he must simply hold on a little longer. Yet when Rommel's staff officers calculated the actual quantities of fuel being promised versus the amounts needed to resume offensive operations, the gap remained enormous. The High Command was ordering Rommel to perform miracles with resources that existed primarily in optimistic planning documents rather than in actual fuel depots. On the 21st of July, Ahmedek launched a counteroffensive designed to throw Rommel's forces back and relieve pressure on the El Alamein position. The attack, focused on the Rouissat Ridge and Tel El Issa sectors, initially achieved significant success. British and Commonwealth forces recaptured positions lost earlier in the month and advanced several kilometers in some sectors. Rommel's ability to respond was crippled by the fuel shortage. His panzer divisions, which would normally have launched immediate counterattacks to seal off British penetrations, instead had to carefully husband their limited fuel reserves for truly critical situations. The result was a battle that seesawed back and forth for several days, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage, but with Rommel losing ground he could ill afford to give up. By the end of July, the tactical situation at El Alamein had crystallized into a stalemate that would persist for months. Rommel's forces held a defensive line running from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression, but they lacked the fuel and supplies to push forward. The British held their positions and continued to receive reinforcements and equipment at rates Rommel could only dream of achieving. The race had been lost not on the battlefield but in the Mediterranean Sea, where British submarines and aircraft had strangled the Axis supply line with a thoroughness that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Rommel, standing in his command post and studying the maps that showed British strength growing daily, came to understand a truth that would haunt him for the remainder of his life: genius without gasoline was simply a form of slow-motion defeat. The physical and psychological toll on Rommel himself during this period was severe. The field marshal, who had always led from the front and drove himself and his staff with relentless energy, began showing signs of exhaustion and illness. By late July, he was suffering from chronic stomach ailments, likely stress-related, and recurrent infections aggravated by the desert climate. His personal physician, Professor Horster, examined him on the 23rd of July and noted in his medical diary that Rommel appeared physically and mentally exhausted to a degree I have not previously observed. The doctor attributed this condition not merely to the physical hardships of desert warfare but to the psychological strain of commanding an army that was slowly being strangled by logistics. Rommel's health issues would worsen throughout August and September, eventually leading to his temporary evacuation from Africa in late September for medical treatment. What the fuel crisis taught Rommel, though he resisted the lesson initially, was that modern warfare had evolved into something fundamentally different from the conflicts of previous generations. In the First World War, an army could operate on relatively modest supply requirements: ammunition, food, water, and fodder for horses. Even the early years of the Second World War had seen campaigns where operational skill and tactical excellence could compensate for logistical limitations. But by 1942, mechanized armies consumed supplies at rates that made logistics as important as any other factor in determining victory or defeat. A panzer division engaged in active combat operations required approximately 30 to 40 tons of supplies per day, with fuel representing roughly half that tonnage. Multiply that by several divisions operating over supply lines thousands of kilometers long, and the logistical challenge became almost insurmountable. The summer and early fall of 1942 at El Alamein became a study in gradual strangulation. Small-scale attacks and counterattacks continued throughout August and into September, with both sides probing for weaknesses and attempting limited offensives. Rommel launched an attack at Alam el Halfa at the end of August, hoping that one last push might break through British defenses. The attack was planned with the same operational flair that had characterized his earlier victories, a feint in the north followed by a powerful armored thrust around the southern flank of the British position. But the execution was hamstrung from the start by fuel limitations. German tanks had to pause for refueling at points where momentum should have carried them forward. British defenders, now commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, who had replaced Imlec in mid-August, had time to reposition and concentrate forces precisely because German attacks moved in slow motion, constrained by fuel availability. The Battle of Alam el Halfa, fought between the 31st of August and the 5th of September, represented Rommel's last attempt to achieve a breakthrough with the forces available to him. The battle failed not because of any particular tactical error but because every element of the attack was compromised by supply limitations. German tanks advanced, ran low on fuel, and had to halt. British artillery, enjoying plentiful ammunition supplies, pounded the stationary German positions. Royal Air Force bombers attacked German supply columns with impunity because the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel to maintain air cover. When Rommel ordered a withdrawal on the 3rd of September, his forces had to abandon damaged vehicles that might have been recovered, simply because there was no fuel to tow them back to German lines. The arithmetic of attrition was working inexorably against him. In his personal papers from this period, Rommel recorded observations that revealed a man coming to terms with forces beyond his control. In a letter to Lucy dated the 8th of September, after the failure at Alam el Halfa, he wrote with unusual candor, "This is no longer a war I understand. We fight not armies but supply lines, and in that contest we are hopelessly outmatched. The English sit atop the greatest empire in history, with resources from India, America, the entire world. We have what we can beg from the Italians and what survives the journey across the Mediterranean. It is not a question of if we will be defeated but when." This represented a remarkable admission from a commander who had built his reputation on the belief that will and operational excellence could overcome material disadvantages. What Rommel could not have known, but what Allied intelligence had begun to understand, was that his fuel crisis was not merely the result of British interdiction of supply lines but also of German strategic priorities that placed North Africa far down the list of critical theaters. During the summer and fall of 1942, the bulk of German fuel production and reserves were being directed to the Eastern Front, where Army Group South was driving toward the Caucasus oilfields in a campaign that Hitler viewed as infinitely more important than operations in North Africa. The ships that might have carried fuel to Rommel were instead transporting supplies to the Black Sea ports supporting operations in southern Russia. The tanker aircraft that might have flown emergency fuel shipments to Africa were engaged in supporting operations in the Ukraine. From Berlin's perspective, Rommel's campaign was a sideshow, important for propaganda purposes but secondary to the existential struggle against the Soviet Union. The cruel mathematics of supply continued to dominate operations through September and October. British forces, meanwhile, were building up supplies for a massive counteroffensive on a scale that Rommel could barely comprehend. Montgomery, methodical and cautious by temperament, refused to attack until he had assembled overwhelming superiority in every category: tanks, artillery, aircraft, and especially ammunition and fuel. British supply convoys from America and the British Empire arrived at Egyptian ports in a steady stream, unloading thousands of tons of material daily. Tank transporters brought new Sherman and Crusader tanks directly from Alexandria to forward assembly areas, while fuel bozers topped off every British vehicle to full capacity. When Montgomery finally launched his offensive at El Alamein on the 23rd of October, British forces would enjoy a superiority in supplies so vast that units were ordered to fire ammunition lavishly, knowing that more was always available. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on the 23rd of October, 1942, is remembered as Montgomery's great victory, the turning point of the North African campaign. But in many ways, the battle was decided before it began by the supply situation that had been deteriorating since July. Rommel, who had returned to Africa on the 25th of October after being recalled from medical leave in Germany, found himself commanding an army that was literally immobile. His panzer divisions reported fuel stocks sufficient for only 60 to 80 kilometers of movement per vehicle. When Montgomery's attack began with a massive artillery bombardment involving over 1,000 guns firing for hours on end, Rommel could not execute the kind of mobile defense that might have blunted the British assault. His tanks had to fight from static positions, unable to conduct the sweeping counterattacks that were the Afrika Korps trademark. When breakthroughs occurred in the German-Italian defensive line, Rommel lacked the fuel to move reserves quickly enough to seal the gaps. The battle raged for 12 days, from the 23rd of October to the 4th of November. During that time, Rommel's forces conducted a masterful defensive battle under impossible circumstances, extracting maximum value from every liter of fuel and every shell. But the outcome was never in doubt. On the 2nd of November, with his defensive line collapsing and British tanks beginning to break through into open desert, Rommel received an order from Hitler forbidding any retreat and demanding that German and Italian forces hold their positions to the last man. Rommel, recognizing that such an order would result in the total destruction of his army, made the decision to disregard it. On the 4th of November, he ordered a general withdrawal westward, beginning the long retreat that would eventually carry German forces all the way back to Tunisia. The withdrawal from El Alamein was hampered at every stage by the same fuel shortage that had prevented Rommel from reaching Alexandria 4 months earlier. Units that might have conducted an orderly fighting withdrawal instead had to abandon vehicles and equipment because there was no fuel to move them. Italian infantry divisions, lacking motorized transport, were left behind to be captured by advancing British forces. The Afrika Korps, which had entered Egypt with over 200 operational tanks, withdrew with fewer than 30, not because of combat losses but because there was insufficient fuel to move the damaged vehicles and no time to repair them without fuel for the recovery vehicles. The retreat turned into a race against fuel consumption, with German forces abandoning successive defensive positions when they lacked the fuel to maintain them rather than because of British pressure. In retrospect, historians would debate the exact moment when Rommel's campaign in North Africa became unwinnable. Some would point to the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November as the decisive engagement. Others would emphasize the Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria on the 8th of November, which opened a second front in North Africa and made the eventual defeat of Axis forces mathematically certain. But the more perceptive analysts would recognize that the campaign was decided in July, in those first days at El Alamein when Rommel stood 50 kilometers from Alexandria and could not advance because his tanks were out of fuel. Everything that followed, the battles of August and September, Montgomery's October offensive, the long retreat to Tunisia, was simply the working out of consequences that had already been determined by logistics. Rommel himself came to this understanding, though the knowledge brought him no comfort. In his memoirs, written after his return to Germany and before his forced suicide in October 1944, he reflected on the North African campaign with a clarity that only distance and reflection could provide. He wrote, "The Battle of the Supply Lines was lost in June and July of 1942, though we did not recognize it fully at the time. We fought on for another year, and brave men died in battles that could not change the ultimate outcome. When I stood before Alexandria with empty fuel tanks, I should have understood that we were finished. But I believed, as soldiers always believe, that courage and skill could overcome material limitations. It cannot. In modern war, the side with superior logistics will win unless it commits catastrophic errors. We did not commit such errors, but we could not win because we could not fuel our tanks." This admission represented a profound psychological shift for a commander whose entire career had been built on the opposite belief. Rommel had risen to prominence precisely because he demonstrated, again and again, that operational brilliance could achieve victories against numerically superior forces. In France in 1940, his Panzer division had raced to the Channel coast while others moved cautiously. In the desert campaigns of 1941 and early 1942, he had consistently defeated larger British forces through superior mobility and concentration of force at decisive points. His entire operational philosophy was predicated on the idea that speed, surprise, and aggressive action could compensate for limitations in numbers or equipment. The fuel crisis at El Alamein shattered that philosophy, forcing him to confront the reality that there were limits even genius could not transcend. The strategic consequences of Rommel's failure at El Alamein rippled far beyond North Africa. Had Rommel captured Alexandria and the Suez Canal in July 1942, as seemed possible in those heady days after the fall of Tobruk, the entire strategic situation in the Mediterranean and Middle East would have been transformed. British access to oil from Iraq and Persia would have been severed. Turkey, neutral but closely watching the balance of power, might have joined the Axis or at least granted Germany transit rights through Anatolia toward the Caucasus oilfields. The entire British position in the Middle East, dependent on supply lines through the Suez Canal, would have collapsed. But none of these possibilities could materialize because Rommel's panzers sat motionless in the Egyptian desert, their fuel tanks empty, while British forces strengthened positions that would eventually prove unbreakable. For the common soldiers of the Afrika Korps, the fuel shortage represented a different kind of defeat, not a dramatic battlefield reverse but a slow realization that their efforts were being undermined by factors entirely beyond their control. Tank crews who had fought with skill and courage throughout the campaign found themselves surrendering not because they had been outfought but because their vehicles could not move. Infantry soldiers who had marched hundreds of kilometers across the desert surrendered to British forces because the trucks that might have evacuated them lacked fuel to operate. The psychological impact of this form of defeat was in some ways more damaging than a traditional battlefield loss. Men could accept being beaten by a more skilled or courageous enemy. It was much harder to accept being defeated by empty-fueled bozers and ships sunk in the Mediterranean. The ultimate irony of Rommel's fuel crisis was that the solution to his supply problems lay tantalizingly close, yet utterly beyond reach. In Iraq and Persia, less than 1,500 kilometers from El Alamein, British and American forces were protecting oilfields that produced millions of barrels of petroleum annually. Had Rommel been able to advance through Egypt, across Sinai, and into Palestine and Iraq, he would have secured access to fuel supplies sufficient to sustain his army indefinitely. But reaching those oilfields required fuel, and fuel was precisely what Rommel did not have. He was trapped in a catch-22 of logistics. He needed fuel to capture the oilfields, but he needed to capture the oilfields to obtain fuel. The mathematics of the situation permitted no solution, only a slow descent into strategic paralysis and eventual defeat. In the decades since the Second World War ended, the Battle of El Alamein has been analyzed and reanalyzed by military historians seeking to understand what determined its outcome. Some emphasize Montgomery's methodical preparation and overwhelming material superiority. Others point to British advantages in intelligence, particularly the breaking of German codes that allowed British commanders to anticipate Rommel's moves. Still others focus on the quality of equipment, particularly the arrival of large numbers of American Sherman tanks that were superior to most German armor. All of these factors played important roles. But beneath them all lay the fundamental reality that Rommel's army, despite its skill and experience, could not operate without fuel, and the fuel could not reach Africa in sufficient quantities to sustain offensive operations. The battle was decided not by any single tactical or strategic decision but by the slow, inexorable arithmetic of logistics working against the Axis cause. Rommel's words in early July, that he might as well be in Berlin as 50 kilometers from Alexandria, captured this reality with brutal precision. Distance meant nothing if one lacked the means to cross it. Tactical skill meant nothing if one's forces were immobilized. Courage and determination meant nothing if the tanks would not start because their fuel tanks were empty. These were hard lessons for a commander who had built his career on mobility and aggressive action, but they were lessons that modern warfare was teaching to military commanders around the world. The Second World War was demonstrating conclusively that industrial capacity and logistics had become as important as tactical brilliance in determining the outcomes of campaigns. Rommel's failure at El Alamein was not a failure of leadership or courage but a failure to overcome the mathematics of supply, and mathematics cannot be defeated by will alone. The story of Rommel's fuel shortage at El Alamein remains relevant today as a reminder of the profound importance of logistics in military operations. Modern military forces, even more dependent on fuel than the armies of 1942, must plan their operations around supply considerations with the same care they devote to tactical planning. The most sophisticated weapons, the most skilled soldiers, the most brilliant operational concepts, all are worthless if the fuel trucks do not arrive. Rommel learned this lesson in the Egyptian desert during the summer of 1942, standing within sight of Alexandria but unable to advance another kilometer. It was a lesson purchased at the cost of thousands of lives and the ultimate defeat of German forces in North Africa, a lesson written in empty fuel tanks and immobilized vehicles scattered across the desert sands. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.